When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped, not because I feared the obvious. It was because of those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I reached to pull the phone from his hand, but he moved a fraction faster, stepping back, still reading. I watched his face change line by line, as if each sentence were a match touching dry paper, and I felt how my life could burn in seconds. Yes, he would learn the truth now. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled as he swiped, and I knew, any moment he would reach the one message that would scorch everything clean or char it beyond recognition. The single message that explained too much and not enough. My phone buzzed in his hands, a new notification gliding over the screen like a knife on ice. I saw the color fall from his face when he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit from the years before we met, a small ritual to keep my voice steady when my thoughts ran in circles. My nerves tangled with the cold clarity of what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even across the 2 steps between us. This was precisely what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago I had made a mistake, the kind that shifted the floorboards under every conversation, and now I didn't know how to move without making the house creak. But let me tell you how it truly happened. Before I share the secret I have tried to hide carefully for so long, write in the comments where you are watching this from, and answer one question. Have you ever kept a secret with all your strength and still watched it slip from your hands? The morning it began did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived in small sounds, the hoof tap of a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, the slow sigh of the refrigerator, the muffled thud of a delivery truck at the curb. In the mirror I saw a woman who still knew how to stand straight but had forgotten how to lean. The robe slipped off my shoulder as I tied it tighter and waited for the kettle to whisper. Even then, I thought the ache in my back was just an echo of last night's restless sleep. I told myself that ache was all there was. In truth, the ache had a shape. It lived in the pauses of our marriage, those careful, polite intervals where kindness stood in for closeness. My husband is a good man, steady in the way a lighthouse is steady, necessary, reliable, always turned outward. He loves work. He respects routines. He believes in fixing what can be measured with a level and a wrench. Lately he had been leaving earlier, returning later, bringing home the scent of rain and asphalt instead of wine and conversation. I would find receipts folded into perfect quarters in the laundry room, line items for bolts and paint and gas, inventory for a life that kept us sheltered but not warm. I had reasons for everything. That is how self-deception works. I organized closets to avoid organizing thoughts. I made lists, groceries, calls to return, a dentist appointment, new towels for the guest room, as if fresh cotton could dress the silence. I chose dresses that fit well but did not ask to be noticed. I told myself desire was a season that had simply shifted, like a long summer softening into a practical autumn. When he told me his son would be staying with us for a while, I agreed without thinking. The upstairs guest room had been ready for months, sheets pressed, a spare phone charger coiled on the nightstand. He arrived with a duffel and a careful smile, taller than I remembered, older too, old enough to look me in the eye without glancing away. He set the bag down in the hall and thanked me for letting him stay. His voice was low, unhurried. It made ordinary phrases sound considered. I said it was no trouble at all. It wasn't. Not then. Memory works out of order, and so does guilt. Today I can give you the shape of that first week only by stitching together what I noticed and what I ignored. On Tuesday he fixed the faucet upstairs, crouching under the sink until the dripping stopped mid-breath. On Wednesday he carried the heavy boxes from the garage to the attic without being asked, the tendons in his forearms like quiet cables under the skin. On Thursday he came back from the store with the wrong brand of tea and apologized, and I told him it didn't matter, and then I made a pot of it anyway just to prove it. On Friday I found the old family photo album open on the coffee table, a picture of me and my husband tucked in its plastic sleeve. We were younger, shoulders touching, laughter caught before it fell. I pressed the plastic back down as if smoothing a sheet over a restless sleeper. There were small journeys that week, too. Errands turned into routes for thinking. I drove to the market across town because I liked the way the aisles curved and the light slid along the polished floor. I stopped at the pharmacy for bandages and came home with a new hand cream I didn't need. I took a longer way back, past the park where years ago, we had eaten apples on a bench and wiped the juice from our wrists with paper napkins. I told myself that wandering was a harmless habit, but the road knows when it is being used to avoid a door. The first time I noticed my back more than my thoughts, I was standing at the sink. The kettle had gone quiet and the cups were lined like witnesses. I reached to the top shelf for a jar and felt the muscle seize, a quick, bright knot of pain. I must have made a sound because he stepped into the kitchen, brow lifted, the question already in his expression. I waved it away. Just a twinge, I said, more to keep the air steady than to tell the truth. He nodded and opened the window, letting in a thin slice of fresh air. The scent of cut grass traveled in from a neighbor's yard. I tried to breathe the way the garden breathed, without argument. That night my husband called from the road. He would be late, he said, then later still. His voice was a map with no topography. We talked logistics, tomorrow's errands, the timing of a repair visit for the washing machine, until silence showed up like an extra person on the line. I wanted to tell him about the back pain. I wanted him to say, "I'll be home in an hour." Instead, I said it was nothing and that he should drive carefully. He thanked me. We hung up. The house resumed its measured breathing. I did not plan what happened next. Planning would make it sound deliberate, and it wasn't. After dinner, the ache turned from a knot to a rope along my spine. I moved carefully around the living room like a person balancing a tray. He was in the doorway watching, holding a book he hadn't opened. "You're stiff," he said. It wasn't a question, and I didn't answer. I sat and pressed my palms against my lower back until the heat of my hands faded. He set the book down. "I know a stretch that helps," he said. "If you want." I heard the permission, not the pressure. I said I would try later. It was the kind of later that means not now, but maybe when it feels safe to admit I need something. Sleep, when it came in layers. I dreamed of staircases, of climbing and never finding the landing. I woke to the sound of rain. The house always sounded different in the rain, as if speaking a softer language. I showered, dressed, chose a sweater that skimmed rather than clung. In the hallway mirror I saw the same woman, but sharper around the eyes. The back pain was quieter, an ember instead of a spark. I decided to be grateful for that. At breakfast he asked if I needed anything from town. I said no, then sent him for the brand of tea he had missed the day before. When he left, I cleaned as if a visit were scheduled, dusted the shelves, fluffed the pillows on the couch, emptied the trash even though it wasn't full. There is a kind of order that pretends to be virtue. I practiced it. When he returned, he had the tea and the right flowers without being told, white lilies, their scent clean and almost medicinal. He set them in a glass vase with the unpracticed care of someone who has watched but not done this many times. I thanked him. He shrugged, a gesture that meant you're welcome, and also that it was nothing, and also that he noticed what the house had been missing. We stood a moment in the silence lilies bring. In the afternoon, my husband sent a message, a picture of a mile marker, a line about traffic, a promise he would try to be home by Saturday evening. I responded with a thumbs up and the word okay, then stared at my own reply as if it belonged to a stranger. When you start speaking in symbols, it is because words have grown heavy. I put the phone face down and stepped outside. The yard was a palette of ordinary greens. He was repairing a loose board in the fence, a hammer steady in his hand. I should have gone back inside, but I asked, instead, if he needed anything, water, a different nail, the rubber mallet my husband prefers. He said he was fine. He always said he was fine. I watched him measure the board against the post, watched the small adjustments, the way patience looks when turned into motion. I thought about precision, about how some people meet the world with careful edges so they don't cut what they love. Evening found us in separate rooms, doors open. He read. I tried to. The house smelled faintly of lilies and sawdust. My back ached again, but less. I told myself that tomorrow I would try the stretch he suggested. That tomorrow I would sleep without staircases. That tomorrow my husband would call from a quieter road and we would talk about something other than schedules. I told myself so many tomorrows that night that I forgot to ask who would live in them with me. Before I turned off the lamp, I thought about a fact I had avoided naming. There is a difference between loneliness and being alone. The first expands in company, the second can be a sanctuary. I was lonely. The house knew it. The lilies, opening their white mouths wider by the hour, knew it. Even my back seemed to know, and so it clenched to give the feeling a body. I slept, finally, and in the last stretch before morning I dreamed I was at the market again, and the aisles were rivers and the lists were boats, and I let one list drift away because I wanted to see what happened to a day without plans. When I woke, the rain had stopped. The faucet upstairs did not drip. The silence felt less like emptiness and more like a stage waiting for someone to walk out and say something simple and true. I did not know the words yet. I only knew their weight. The day opened with a sharp click from the front gate, a sound so clean it might as well have been a metronome striking the first beat. I was already awake, the kind of awake that has nothing to do with rest, watching the window breathe in and out with the wind. My lower back pulsed in a disciplined rhythm, not a scream but a steady instruction, be careful, move slower, pay attention. Rain had rinsed the night away and left the streets rinsed to a dull shine. The lilies on the dining table were wider now, white throats tilted like small trumpets. I made tea and tried to convince my body that warmth could be a decision. The hook came from the smallest place, a notification on my phone. A message from my husband with a single line about a subcontractor delay and an estimate that he would not be back until Sunday night. There was no apology, just a practical timeline, the kind he prefers. I stared at the screen and felt the house adjust around me, as if a chair had been pulled out from the table and no one planned to sit down. I set the phone face down and let the silence do what it does best, collect details. Outside, the gate clicked again. He had gone to the hardware store early. By 9, the kitchen smelled of toast, oranges, and the faint medicinal sweetness of the lilies. I moved in slow arcs, keeping my spine tall, counting steps as if distance could domesticate pain. When he returned, he carried a small paper bag and the thoughtful rest of someone who has already decided to help. He placed the bag by the sink, took out a heat patch and a small bottle of unscented oil, nothing fancy, nothing that could be mistaken for a gesture more complicated than care. For your back, he said, not as a question but as a simple offering. I thanked him and pretended the act cost me nothing. The morning arranged itself into useful tasks. He tightened a cabinet hinge that had been loyal for years and suddenly wasn't. I wiped the inside of the refrigerator, one shelf at a time, performing that satisfying ritual where order and cold light cooperate. The rhythm calmed me, lift, wipe, return, align labels, close. When I finished, I felt the ache again, brightened by exertion. On the counter, the heat patch waited like a small, square promise. I took it upstairs. In the bedroom mirror the truth was plain. Fatigue had pressed a soft fingerprint under my eyes. I peeled the backing from the patch and fixed it carefully, standing just so, as if posture alone could repair what the calendar had nudged out of place. For a few minutes I stood still, waiting for warmth. The first bloom of heat was modest, then it spread, a practical sun beneath the skin. I breathed. I thought of the stretches he had mentioned and wondered if I could do them without asking for help. Pride is a stubborn furniture piece, it takes two to move it, but I tried anyway. Downstairs again, the house divided its sounds into columns: hammer in the garage, kettle on the stove, a distant leaf blower, the elevator soft sigh of traffic on the main road. I poured more tea and carried the cup to the dining table, where I had set out the mail like a row of polite strangers. Among the envelopes sat a postcard from a museum we once visited, a fragment of a painting I loved, blue so deep it felt like velvet seen in shadow. I turned it over. The caption named the year, the painter, the medium, none of which addressed why a person will stand in front of a painting and not move because something true is happening and they cannot yet name it. I set the card back down. By late morning the light had the texture of milk. He came in from the garage wiping his hands on a cloth that used to be one of my husband's shirts. The smell of cut wood rode in on his shoulders. He asked how the heat patch was working. I said it helped. He nodded, then looked toward the living room where the couch sloped into a comfortable suggestion of rest. He hesitated at the threshold, that exact reluctance that is more respectful than asking. I could show you those stretches, he said, voice careful. They're simple. They help. I could have said no. I could have asked him to write them down. I could have picked 1,000 polite exits. Instead, I put the cup down and said, all right. We made the room practical, moved the low table aside, folded the throw blanket, aligned a cushion for support. He suggested socks off, shoes already gone, the rug offering its soft firmness like a deliberate ground. I stood where the light fell in a rectangle, warm but not bright, and waited for instruction. He kept his voice even, explaining where to place my feet, how to let the knees remember softness, how to exhale into the shape the spine prefers when it is tired. I followed, aware of the way the body listens when it trusts the speaker. My breathing found a slower geography. Imagine a string at the crown of your head, he said, his hands at his sides, demonstration without touch. It's lifting you up, but the weight is running down the back like water. I pictured it. I let my shoulders dissolve a little, let the jaw unclench. The first stretch planted itself at the base of my spine and pointed upward like a measured arrow. The ache dimmed, not gone but reworded. He asked if he could adjust my stance. I nodded. His fingers brushed my hip bone, a brief, precise correction, nothing else. The sensation arrived as information first, then as heat, then as a complicated quiet. I held the pose, counted to 10, released. We did 3 more, hamstrings, lower back, a twist for the thoracic spine that made my ribs feel like shutters on a house clattering open to air. Between each, I rested my hands on my thighs and let feeling return in waves. He spoke only when necessary, the room tuned to the frequency of usefulness. And yet usefulness has cousins: care, attention, the soft electricity of being seen. I kept my eyes on a seam in the rug to keep balance. The world narrowed to breath, to the press of wool against skin, to the pleasing click of alignment when joints agree to work. When it was over, I sat on the edge of the couch with a towel across my shoulders, heat patch still warming under my sweater. He asked if the oil might help for a minute on the lower back, nothing intense, a practical measure. I said yes because saying no would have been a performance of a boundary I did not actually want. He poured a small line of oil into his palms and rubbed them together until sound became a soft whisper. Then he touched my back with the careful neutrality of someone turning a page. His thumbs moved in slow, even tracks beside the spine, not pressing, just speaking in the alphabet of muscle. I closed my eyes and counted the seconds between breaths the way you count waves to center yourself. The clock in the hallway ticked with the authority of an old metronome. Through the window, a neighbor walked her dog, a small white animal that trotted with comic dignity. The ordinary world continued, and yet the room changed. Not with candles or music or anything that could be confused with theater. It changed because connection is architectural, it rearranges load-bearing walls. The ache in my back softened under his hands, and in that softening a separate ache announced itself, one that had nothing to do with vertebrae and everything to do with time. I thought about the years of efficient affection, about the kind of love that knows your shoe size and the blood type on your medical card but forgets the way your back tightens when you carry groceries up the stairs. I thought about the quiet bravery of asking to be touched and the equal bravery of responding with restraint. He stopped, wiped his hands, and stood a half-step back. Space returned like cool air. I turned to thank him and found him closer than the sentence allowed. The room felt precise, the lilies behind him like small witnesses. My mouth formed the words and then did not. The idea of gratitude collided with the more dangerous idea of recognition. We looked at each other the way people do when they are checking a mirror for damage and find instead an unexpected clarity. We kissed. The moment after was sharp as glass. I stood, my legs unsure, my hand finding the back of the couch as if furniture could be an alibi. He stepped away first, hands open, the universal posture of someone meaning no harm. Breath found me again in small portions. I said thank you, and the words were paper-thin but true. He nodded, his gaze steady but gentled down, and then he left the room with the quiet of a person who understands a door can hold a life on either side. I did the only thing that made sense, I cleaned. Not as penance, not quite, but as a way to keep the inner noise from stepping to the microphone. I wiped fingerprints from surfaces that never accumulated any. I arranged the mail into a stack by size. I trimmed the lily stems and refreshed the water. In the kitchen, the tea had cooled into a version of itself I did not want. I poured it out and watched the small brown stream swirl away, a domestic weather pattern inside the sink. When I looked up, the window returned my reflection with a firmness I could not negotiate. A woman, a house, a day trying to be ordinary. I walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the patch still offering its measured heat. A text from my husband waited on the nightstand, visible when I picked up the phone to check the time, a thumbs up in response to the grocery list I had sent earlier. I stared at that small icon and thought about how language collapses when it grows too tired to lift its own intent. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I typed and erased 3 versions of a simple sentence that said nothing important. I set the phone down face first. The room steadied. Afternoon stretched its fabric thin. I considered a walk but stayed inside, unwilling to put my feet on streets that might require decisions I wasn't ready to make. Instead, I folded laundry with the care of a person folding maps, tracing routes I did not plan to travel. I counted pairs of socks like minutes. I listened for footsteps in the hall and heard none. When he finally passed the door, heading toward the stairs, the sound was brief, respectful, a punctuation mark closing the sentence of our morning. Dusk found the house humming its low, familiar song. I cooked a simple dinner, rice, vegetables, an omelette folded into a neat crescent, and ate at the counter, the plate balanced over a woven placemat like a small island. I did not replay the moment in Technicolor. I did not assign it a meaning larger than the room could hold. I let it sit where it belonged, proof that I was still capable of being moved, evidence that stillness had a cost. I washed the dishes. I dried my hands. I turned off the light in stages, refusing drama the easy victory of a sudden dark. Before sleep, I stood at the window and watched the street lamps knit golden circles onto the pavement. Somewhere a television laughed canned laughter. Somewhere a freight train sighed. In the glass I saw my face layered over the world, a transparency that did not quite line up. I thought about boundaries, that useful word people use as if it were a fence that cannot be climbed. In truth, boundaries are more like chalk lines, clear, necessary, and easy to smudge when rain arrives. I resolved to redraw mine in the morning, with brighter chalk on drier ground. I lay down carefully, arranged the pillow just so, and let the day settle in the drawer where memory keeps its newest files. Sleep did not come quickly. It came responsibly, checking locks, turning off the oven, straightening the stack of letters. When it finally arrived, it brought a dream of a museum hallway, of a blue painting scene from Too Close, of stepping back inch by inch until the colors found their shape. I woke once in the night to the sound of someone walking to the kitchen for water. The house shared the sound with me and then closed its mouth. I rested my palm on my spine where the heat had been. The spot was warm still, or maybe it was only the echo of a day that had finally admitted what it wanted and what it could not have, and how both truths could live at the same address for a while longer. The morning after felt thinner than it should have, as if the air itself had been stretched and left to dry. I woke early, before the sky had finished choosing its color, and lay there listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the tick of the clock in the hallway. My back felt better, almost entirely, but the improvement carried its own weight. It meant there was no excuse to replay the previous day under the banner of necessity. I stayed in bed a few minutes longer, as if stillness could undo what movement had allowed. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the house smelled faintly of coffee. He had been up for a while. I could hear the soft scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor, the brief hollow sound of a cupboard door closing. The domestic rhythm was so ordinary it might have belonged to any day, to any house, to any set of people. That ordinariness was the most disorienting thing of all. It suggested that what happened yesterday could be folded into the fabric without tearing it. I knew better. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter, watching the steam curl into the pale morning light. The lilies on the table had begun to drop their pollen, small grains of gold dusting the surface beneath them. I brushed a few onto my fingertip, rubbed them away. He was sitting across the table with a notebook open, pen resting in the crease. When he looked up, his expression was even, offering nothing for me to misinterpret. We exchanged brief words about the weather, about the forecasted rain later in the week. His tone was steady, as if the conversation was simply a bridge from one hour to the next. I spent the late morning in the laundry room, folding sheets with the precision of someone who needs their hands to stay busy. The soft thud of the dryer door closing became a metronome for my thoughts. I imagined the weekend ahead, my husband returning, the shape of the house shifting back to its usual alignment. The days between now and then felt like a narrow hallway I needed to walk through without brushing the walls. By midday, the sun had gained a firmer grip on the sky, pulling long beams across the living room rug. He was outside in the yard, repairing a loose section of the fence. I watched for a moment from the window, then turned away before the moment could become anything else. The kettle whistled, I made tea, this time the correct brand, and carried it to the dining table. I read for a while, the words flowing past me without catching, until the sound of the back door opening drew my attention. He came in with a small stack of mail in one hand, laying it on the counter as he passed. The mail was ordinary, a utility bill, a circular from the market, a plain white envelope addressed to my husband in neat block letters. I sorted them quickly, setting them aside in the order I knew he preferred. It was an easy, mechanical task, but it anchored me in something simple. The afternoon drifted forward in quiet increments. I decided to go to the market for fresh vegetables and a few staples. It was partly an errand, partly a decision to put my body in a place where routine could do the talking. He offered to come along, said he needed a few things as well. I agreed, telling myself it was the practical choice since we could share the drive. The drive itself was uneventful. We talked about the repairs he'd finished in the yard, the upcoming maintenance on the roof, the fact that the neighbor's dog had taken to lying in the shade of our porch. In the market, we moved separately but within sight of each other, selecting items with the efficiency of people who knew their lists by heart. In the produce section, he passed me a bag of apples without comment, and I placed them in the basket. On the way home, the air inside the car felt neutral, the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. I kept my eyes on the road, noting the early signs of autumn in the trees lining the boulevard. A few leaves had already turned, their edges crisp and curling. The season was changing whether or not anyone was ready. Back at the house, I unpacked the groceries, lining them up on the counter before tucking them into their places. The kitchen felt more grounded when everything was where it belonged. He carried his purchases upstairs without a word. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs faded quickly, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator. For a moment, I let the quiet sit heavy, as if testing its weight. Later, I went out to the garden to trim back some overgrown branches. The work was small and repetitive, a way to measure time without a clock. The air was cooler now, the light beginning to shift toward evening. When I came back inside, he was on the couch with a book, the room lit by the amber spill of a single lamp. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his page. I took my tea to the armchair across from him and opened my own book. We read in parallel, the space between us filled with the sound of turning pages. As the day began to close, I thought about dinner. I chose something simple, a pasta with roasted vegetables, a salad on the side. Cooking settled me, the steps were clear, the results predictable. The smells filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. He joined me briefly to wash his hands at the sink, then set the table without needing to be asked. We ate quietly, the conversation minimal but not strained. When the plates were cleared, I washed them while he dried, the domestic choreography practiced and wordless. After dinner, I went upstairs to tidy the guest room. It was a habit now, one I couldn't quite explain. I smoothed the bedspread, straightened the books on the nightstand, checked the drawer for the extra charger. Everything was in place, exactly as it had been. Still, I lingered a moment longer before turning off the light. Downstairs, he was at the dining table again, notebook open, pen moving across the page. I didn't ask what he was writing. I poured myself another cup of tea, then carried it into the living room. The clock in the hallway marked the seconds with steady precision. The house felt suspended, balanced between what it had been and what it might become. I sat there until the tea cooled, then took the empty cup to the sink. When I went to bed, the air in the bedroom was still warm from the day. I lay on my side, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as he moved in the hall, the gentle click of a door closing. My eyes stayed open longer than they needed to, tracing the familiar lines of the ceiling in the dim light. The house settled gradually, each sound a reminder that another day had passed without breaking the surface. Still, under it all, something remained, a current running quietly, waiting for the next turn in its path. The next morning began with a decision made before I could explain it to myself. I woke earlier than I needed to, the sky the color of paper just before ink touches it, and recognized the nervous energy that sometimes accompanies the start of a project, clear, propulsive, almost useful. The house had the nervous silence of a theater 10 minutes before the audience sits. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, glanced at the neatly folded blanket, then moved on as if the air were a hallway I had to walk through to reach the day. Downstairs, the lilies had begun to bow under their own perfume. I opened a window. Fresh air moved through the room with the tact of a careful guest. The hook arrived in the shape of motion. I told myself the living room needed new bulbs for the lamps, the entryway a better mat for the coming rain, the kitchen a different seal for the window over the sink. The list was both honest and dishonest. Nothing is more convincing than a practical errand when you need a reason to leave the house with someone. In the mirror by the front door I saw a woman dressed for ease rather than effect, dark pants, a sweater that skimmed. I added a scarf, not for beauty but for weather, then removed it again, as if fabric could testify. He was already in the kitchen with his mug, steam lifting in a pale ribbon. "Hardware store run?" I said, too briskly, as if the plan had been previously discussed. He looked at me as if testing the idea for weight. "Sure," he answered. One word, neither invitation nor refusal, and yet I felt the day click into alignment. We cleared our cups, gathered the small artifacts that allow a trip to proceed: keys, a reusable bag, a shopping list written in a handwriting I hardly recognized as mine, and stepped out to where the morning was trying to be honest. The car still held the faint smell of yesterday's groceries, a blend of cardboard and apples. He drove. I watched the houses scroll by, each with its own weather vanes of routine, a man walking a dog that paused at the same patch of grass, a woman shaking crumbs from a tablecloth onto the back steps, a child's scooter left beside a hedge, tipped slightly as if listening. In the hardware store, I'll stood like sentences waiting for verbs. We moved through them separately at first, then in tandem, comparing screws as though the size of a thread could determine the strength of a season. Standing in front of a wall of bulbs, I learned again how choices multiply beyond reason. Warm light, cool light, daylight, lumens like numbers on a scoreboard. I reached for one, hesitated, reached for another. He picked up a box and said, "These won't flicker." It was not a promise, only a suggestion born from experience, and it relieved me to accept it. We found the weather stripping, a pack of felt pads for chair legs, a new doormat with a simple stripe. None of it dramatic, all of it reassuring in the way that minor improvements let you pretend the structure is unassailable. "Coffee?" I asked when we reached the register and the day still felt non-committal. He nodded. Outside, the light had sharpened into a clear, friendly brightness. We crossed to a small cafe that hadn't yet filled with the mid-morning conversations of people with tidy lives. I chose a table by the window, not for romance but for visibility. Sitting across from him, I noticed how sunlight flattened pretenses, faces looked more like themselves, cups showed their chips. The barista placed 2 mugs between us, and the steam stitched the gap for a moment before it thinned. We spoke about repairs, the roofer's schedule, the way the fence lean could be corrected with a brace until spring. We avoided the day that had come before, not out of shame exactly, but out of an agreement I hadn't realized we had made. A couple at the next table discussed paint colors like seasons, winter whites, a spring green that would look sallow in certain light. A delivery truck sighed to a stop outside, a small exhale of air brakes. We let the banal world do some of our talking for us. At one point he asked, "How's your back?" And because the question was visible on the table before he spoke it, I didn't startle. "Better," I said, and then, after a breath, "Thank you." He acknowledged it with the brief lift of a shoulder, a gesture that said both that he had heard me and that we would not be building a cathedral on gratitude today. The relief of that boundary was almost physical. It allowed me to finish my coffee and not search the bottom of the cup for meanings. On the walk back to the car the wind picked up, quick and cool. The sky had rearranged itself into pieces of gray, as if practicing. I felt a drop of rain on my wrist, then another, the way a conversation sometimes turns before anyone means it to. He opened the trunk, we placed the small bags inside, we stood there a second too long, both watching the first lines of rain stitch across the parking lot. Then we got in, doors closing with the gentle finality of a decision made for the next 5 minutes. On the drive home, the wipers kept time like patient metronomes. He turned on the radio, an oldies station playing a song I knew by heart for reasons I could not name. The lyric about someone waiting at a station, the promise that travel would solve distance, and I thought of how many songs lied for comfort. My phone buzzed with a text from my husband, a photo of a worksite, the caption a note about the crew staying late, a rain delay, an attempt to make up the time. I typed, "Drive safe," and sent it with a small, deliberate touch. Responsibility has its own rhythm. I wanted to honor it. Back at the house, we carried the bags inside and dispersed into our rolls. He unboxed the bulbs, tested one in a table lamp, and we both watched the light steady into a practical glow. I cut the felt pads and placed them under the dining chairs, the small scrape of adhesive satisfying. We worked without commentary. The rain settled into a more ambitious pattern, pattering on the kitchen window with the consistency of thought. By early afternoon, the house was a map of small adjustments. In the entryway, the new mat lay clean and factual. In the living room, the lamp near the couch no longer flared when switched on. I ran my hand along the edge of the window above the sink and felt the weather stripping hold tight. Improvement can be a kind of mercy. It tells you that while you can't revise the past, you can still tighten a hinge. Motion asked for more motion. We still need those shelves, I said, almost to myself, and then more directly, if we go now, we can beat the heavier rain. He agreed. The second trip felt less like an errand and more like the continuation of a sentence. We drove to a large store that smelled faintly of cardboard and timber and the future. Choosing shelves should have been easy, dimensions, weight capacity, color, but the decision loosened other questions, the kind you answer without saying out loud, who are we arranging this room for? What kind of order declares itself without announcing a preference? I ran my fingers along a smooth edge and pretended I was cataloging grain patterns instead of mapping out the space where my days unfolded. We settled on a simple design, pale wood, clean lines, nothing that tried to steal attention. On the way to the cashier, we passed an aisle of rugs. He stopped at a runner with a muted stripe. I didn't say anything, just nodded. It would make sense in the hallway, softening the morning's first steps. The purchase was unremarkable. The kindness was not. The rain ceased as we carried the flat boxes inside, the late afternoon light returning with a different tone, cooler, more self-aware. Assembly required both of us, align the pieces, anchor with the right screws, tighten until snug. We worked like neighbors who share a fence, not owners who share a key. I held boards steady while he fixed brackets. He checked the level and asked me to confirm the bubble's position. In that simple glance at the suspended liquid, a tiny world measuring our alignment, I found a steadiness I hadn't expected. When the shelves were upright and secure, we stepped back together and looked at them as if they might introduce themselves. Books came next, then framed photographs that had been drifting between drawers. I did not dwell on the images, faces younger than they are now, smiles wrongly convinced of their permanence. I placed them with the neutrality of an archivist. On the top shelf I set the museum postcard with the blue I loved, leaning it against the wall between a small vase and a stack of travel guides from trips we had meant to take. He added a modest wooden bowl he had sanded smooth last winter, the grain like a slow river under varnish. The arrangement felt balanced, untheatrical, honest. We ate a late lunch with the quiet appetite of people who have done a respectable amount of work. Bread, cheese, sliced pears, a few olives. The conversation stayed at the surface where it could float without fear. When we finished, he offered to take the cardboard to the recycling drop-off. I thanked him, and he left with the boxes tucked under one arm, the utility of the gesture almost protective in its simplicity. Alone, I stood before the new shelves and tried to measure how much was different and how much I was merely willing to see. The afternoon slid toward early evening. I went upstairs and changed into a clean sweater, brushed my hair, retied it with a plain band. In the mirror, there were fewer shadows under my eyes. Improvement, again, in small increments. When I came down, the front door opened on a gust of damp air. He shook rain from his jacket at the threshold and set 2 paper cups on the console table. "They gave me these by mistake," he said, which was probably true. I took one, grateful for the warmth, more grateful for the way humility can make an ordinary thing feel like care without debt. As dusk approached, the lamps we had installed glowed in their new accuracy. The runner in the hall softened footsteps into quiet declarations. I felt, for a few minutes, like the house had forgiven us our week of unevenness, had decided to accept our efforts at order as evidence of intent. But guilt is not a judge, it is a weather system. It shifts and returns. I thought about my husband's text, the late shift, the long drive back on Sunday night if the rain behaved. I pictured his face at the door and tried to inventory what would be visible to him, the new mat, the brighter bulbs, the shelves sturdy against the wall. The rest would stay where it already was, distributed in careful silences, kept in drawers that closed properly. Before sleep, I wrote a list for the morning: call the roofer to confirm Monday, wash the hallway runner to remove the factory dust, rearrange the top shelf once more, not because it needed it but because attention is a way of speaking when speech could be a trespass. I left the list on the kitchen counter. In bed, I listened to the occasional car lift water from the street, the hiss dissolving into the night. Somewhere in the house, floorboards adjusted to the day's new weight. I lay still and tried to unwind the thread of movement we had pulled through our hours, asking myself whether motion had been the solution or only the disguise. When sleep came, at last, it began with the image of a level small bubble centered between two lines, held there by patience and a hand too steady to be called accidental. The morning began with a low haze that made the street outside look as though it had been dusted in chalk. I woke to the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the sort of smell that doesn't just announce the drink, it announces that someone else has been awake before you. The house was quiet in the kind of way that tells you it has already been moving without you, that the day has begun whether you join it or not. I pulled on a sweater and moved through the upstairs hallway, my hand brushing the banister out of habit. The lilies in the vase downstairs had wilted slightly overnight, petals slack, stems bending toward the table like tired limbs. I made a mental note to replace them before the weekend. He was at the counter, leaning slightly over his phone, a half-empty mug beside him. I poured my own cup, the steam rising between us like a neutral divider, and asked if he had plans for the day. He shrugged, said he had a few errands but nothing urgent. His voice had the calm efficiency of someone describing the weather, factual, unadorned. I told him I was thinking of working in the garden before the forecasted rain set in. The conversation ended there, naturally, like water draining from a shallow dish. By mid-morning, the light had grown sharper. I put on my boots and went to the garden with a pair of clippers, aiming to clear the last of the overgrown branches near the back fence. The ground was damp from the night before, the air thick enough to feel on the skin. I worked steadily, the repetitive snip and gather a kind of metronome for my thoughts. Every so often I would glance toward the house, see the kitchen window, the faint reflection of movement inside. It was easier to keep my focus on the branches. When I came back in, my boots leaving faint marks on the mat, he was clearing space on the dining table. He had a small stack of receipts and was arranging them into neat rows, each one flattened carefully by hand. I washed my hands, then joined him, sliding into the chair across from his work. He glanced up, offered a nod, then returned to his task. It wasn't the kind of activity that required company, but the shared space felt like its own quiet conversation. Around noon, I suggested we drive to the farmer's market a few miles away. It wasn't on my list of chores for the week, but I had been thinking about it since morning. The market on weekdays was calmer, the stalls easier to navigate without the jostle of weekend crowds. He agreed without hesitation. We gathered our bags and keys, stepping out into the pale sunlight that had managed to hold off the clouds for now. The drive there was brief, the road winding past low brick buildings and stretches of open lots. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere nearby, a reminder that the season was shifting. At the market, the stalls were lined with baskets of late-season produce, apples in deep reds and golds, squash stacked like small sculptures, carrots with their green tops still attached. I chose carefully, weighing each piece in my hand before placing it into the bag. He lingered by a stall selling jars of honey, talking briefly with the vendor about the different floral sources. I watched from a distance, my hands wrapped around the straps of the shopping bag, before moving on to a table of herbs. We left with more than I had planned: apples, a small loaf of bread, a bunch of rosemary, 2 jars of honey, one light, one dark. The air had cooled slightly during our time there, the first hints of the forecasted rain gathering at the horizon. On the way home, we drove with the windows cracked, letting the wind thread its way through the car. The conversation was minimal, but the quiet didn't press. It simply existed. Back at the house, we divided the tasks of putting things away without discussion. The bread went into the bread box, the apples into the wooden bowl on the counter, the rosemary into a jar of water to keep it fresh. I could hear him upstairs a few minutes later, the faint sound of something being shifted or set down. I stayed in the kitchen, brewing tea, letting the rosemary scent my hands after handling it. When he came back down, he had changed shirts, his hair slightly damp as though he'd splashed water on his face. In the afternoon, I started on a batch of soup with some of the vegetables we'd bought. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, and seasoning filled the kitchen with purpose. He came in once to refill his glass of water, pausing to watch me slice carrots. I didn't look up until he stepped back, offering a quiet "smells good" before leaving the room. It was such a small moment, but it held more weight than the words alone. The rain began mid-afternoon, a steady patter against the windows. I turned on the lamp near the couch, the one we'd fitted with the new bulb earlier in the week, and carried my tea to the living room. He was already there, reading, his legs stretched out. I took the armchair, curling one foot beneath me. The rain filled the pauses between page turns. From time to time, I would look up from my own book and watch the water trace paths down the glass. By early evening, the soup was ready. We ate at the dining table, the bowls steaming, bread sliced thick on a plate between us. The conversation stayed close to the surface: the quality of the produce at the market, the expected end of the rain by morning, the repairs still needed on the fence. When the meal was over, we cleared the table together, moving in a rhythm that had become almost habitual. Later, I went upstairs to put fresh linens in the guest room, another quiet habit that didn't require explanation. The bedspread was smooth under my hands, the pillows set neatly at the head of the bed. I lingered for a moment, adjusting the curtain so it fell evenly. Downstairs, I could hear the faint clink of dishes being set to dry. I stood still until the sound stopped, then turned off the light and left the room. When I returned to the kitchen, he was leaning against the counter, a mug of tea in his hand. The room was warm from the earlier cooking, the air holding a faint mix of rosemary and rain. I reached past him to take my own mug from the cupboard, and for a moment we were both still, the distance between us narrower than the width of the counter. He looked at me, not with any question or demand, but with the kind of steady acknowledgement that can't be misread. We kissed. The moment was brief, without drama, and ended with both of us stepping back almost in unison. I took my mug to the table, sat down, and sipped as though the tea had been waiting for me. He stayed where he was for a moment longer before setting his mug down and moving to the living room. The quiet that followed was not heavy, but it was precise, aware of itself, aware of what had just happened. I finished my tea slowly, rinsed the mug, and left it on the rack to dry. The rain had eased outside, the drops smaller, more scattered. Upstairs, the house felt like it was settling in for the night, each sound finding its place. I stood by the window for a while, watching the streetlights blur slightly in the damp air, before turning away and preparing for bed. The day had closed on its own terms, leaving everything exactly as it appeared and nothing exactly as it had been. The morning after the rain felt heavier than the day before, the sky layered with slow-moving clouds that seemed content to stay. I woke to the faint sound of water still dripping from the eaves, each drop spaced far enough apart to make the silence between them noticeable. The air inside the house was cool, not cold, but carrying the kind of stillness that follows a long storm. I moved through the upstairs hallway, passing the guest room without pausing, and went down to the kitchen. He was already there, standing at the counter with his hands wrapped around a mug. The smell of coffee was strong, grounding the room in a familiar rhythm. I poured my own, the steam rising in gentle spirals, and leaned against the counter opposite him. We spoke briefly about the weather, about the chance the rain would return by evening. Our words were straightforward, neither of us trying to stretch them into anything else. After breakfast, I decided to focus on the kitchen cupboards. They had been organized enough to pass as orderly, but I knew the arrangement was uneven, things stored in ways that didn't quite make sense. He offered to help without being asked, and I accepted. We emptied one shelf at a time, setting jars, plates, and glasses onto the counter. The clink of ceramic and glass filled the air in small intervals. I wiped down each shelf while he sorted the contents, grouping similar items together, discarding what was cracked or long unused. The work was unremarkable, but the cooperation felt steadying. When we finished, the cupboards looked deliberate. Items faced the same direction, gaps had been closed, and what was needed most often sat within easy reach. I stepped back to take it in and felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from small, visible improvement. He nodded once, as if agreeing silently, before returning the cleaning cloth to the drawer. By midday, the clouds had not lifted. The light was flat, casting no strong shadows. I suggested a short walk to the park before the next wave of rain arrived. He agreed, and we both put on jackets, stepping out into the cool air. The streets were damp but not puddled, the trees along the sidewalk dripping intermittently. We didn't rush, keeping an easy pace. The park was nearly empty, only a few people passing through with umbrellas closed and dangling at their sides. We walked the loop trail once, speaking in fragments about the state of the fence repair, the new shelves, the groceries that might be needed before the weekend. It was conversation shaped by proximity, not necessity. The sound of our steps on the wet path was louder than our voices, and that felt natural. On the way back, the wind picked up slightly, nudging us toward home. Inside, I boiled water for tea while he moved into the living room, flipping through a book he had left on the side table. I brought my cup in and sat across from him, the lamp between us casting a warm light over the page he was reading. The rain returned sooner than expected, tapping steadily against the windows. I watched it for a while, the lines of water distorting the view of the street outside, before picking up my own book. The afternoon settled into a muted rhythm. I prepared a light lunch, cheese, bread, and sliced pears, and we ate at the dining table. Conversation was minimal, and neither of us seemed to find that strange. Afterward, I returned to the kitchen to wash the dishes, hearing the faint sound of him moving something in the hallway closet. Later, when I passed by, I saw the coats had been rearranged and the small box of winter gloves set neatly on the shelf above. In the mid-afternoon, I started on a batch of bread. The process was slow and familiar, measuring flour, mixing the dough, leaving it to rise beneath a cloth. The warmth from the oven made the kitchen feel more like its own season, separate from the gray beyond the windows. He came in once to check the time, mentioning that he might take a drive later to pick up a few supplies for a project in the garage. I nodded, and he left it at that. While the dough rested, I went upstairs to change the linens in our bedroom. The air was cooler there, the window slightly open from the morning. I worked quietly, folding back the blankets, smoothing the sheets, tucking the edges in with practiced hands. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement outside, the branches shifting under the weight of rain, but I kept my focus on the task. Back in the kitchen, the dough had doubled in size. I shaped it into a loaf, set it on the pan, and slid it into the oven. The smell began to spread slowly, a reminder that some things still follow a reliable order. He returned not long after, carrying a small paper bag with a box of nails and a roll of twine inside. He set them on the counter, and we exchanged a brief few words about where they might be stored. By the time the bread was done, the rain had stopped again. We sliced it while still warm, steam curling upward, and ate it with the darker of the 2 honeys we bought at the market. The combination was simple, comforting in a way that didn't ask for conversation to justify it. Evening approached quietly. He moved to the living room with his notebook, and I stayed in the kitchen to tidy the counters, putting away the remaining bread and rinsing the utensils. When I joined him, he was writing, the pen moving steadily across the page. I didn't ask about it. Instead, I sat in the armchair, the sound of the pen and the faint ticking of the hallway clock filling the space between us. After a while, I stood to turn on the porch light. The damp air outside carried the faint scent of earth and leaves. Through the half-open door, I heard the low hum of distant traffic, the occasional splash of a car through shallow water. When I came back inside, he had closed the notebook and set it on the table. We didn't speak much for the rest of the evening. I read for a while, then folded the blanket on the couch and turned off the lamp. The house seemed to take its cues from us, settling into a calm that didn't need to be explained. Upstairs, the quiet deepened. I lay in bed listening to the last of the rain sliding from the gutters, the sound soft enough to pull the day closed without resistance. The morning broke with an unusual clarity, the kind that comes after several days of unsettled weather. Light spilled through the blinds in straight, unobstructed lines, touching the floorboards and drawing long, deliberate shapes across the room. I woke earlier than usual, aware of the quiet but also of the way the house seemed to be holding its breath. My husband had sent a message late the night before saying he'd be delayed another day, maybe 2. I had read it twice, not because I doubted the words but because they felt both expected and disruptive at the same time. Downstairs, the kitchen was still. I set water to boil, measured coffee, and let the small mechanical sounds of the process steady me. He came in as I was pouring the coffee, his hair still damp from a shower, and gave a simple morning before reaching for a cup. We didn't speak much beyond that. Our conversations lately had become an arrangement of necessities, like furniture positioned for easy passage rather than comfort. After breakfast, the day opened without a plan. The sky was a pale, unwavering blue, and the air had the cool dryness of a late-season shift. I suggested a drive into town for a few errands, bread from the bakery, some fruit, maybe a stop at the hardware store for the last of the materials he'd mentioned needing for the garage. He agreed easily, and soon we were in the car, the windows cracked just enough to let the air move through. The streets were not yet crowded, the weekend traffic still hours away. The bakery was warm, fragrant with the smell of fresh loaves. I chose one seeded, one plain, and we added a small bag of rolls almost as an afterthought. At the fruit stall a block away, apples were piled high in bins, their skins polished to a soft shine. I picked out a dozen, each one firm and cool to the touch. We carried the bags back to the car without hurry, the quiet between us not uncomfortable but weighted enough to notice. On the way home, we passed the small park at the edge of town, its benches empty in the mid-morning light. Without discussing it, he slowed and turned into the parking area. We walked a short loop along the main path, the leaves underfoot beginning to change color, some already crisp at the edges. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and the lingering sweetness of summer grass. I felt the simplicity of the moment settle in, as if we were moving through a pocket of time untouched by anything else. Back at the house, the day took on a softer rhythm. I unpacked the bread and fruit, set one of the loaves on the cutting board, and put the rest away. He disappeared into the garage for a while, the faint sound of tools carrying through the open window above the sink. I cleaned the counters, rinsed the apples, and set them in the wooden bowl on the table. By the time he came back inside, I had started on a pot of tea. We sat in the living room, the teapot between us on the low table. The light from the window caught the steam in slow, drifting shapes. He mentioned the garage was nearly organized, that one more afternoon of work would finish it. I nodded, adding that the fence repair looked like it would hold through the winter. It was a conversation made of surface details, yet beneath it I felt the slow undercurrent of something unspoken. As afternoon approached, I started preparing dinner earlier than usual. A roast chicken, vegetables in the oven, bread warming on the side. The smell spread through the house, filling the spaces between rooms. He came into the kitchen once or twice to check on the progress, leaning lightly against the counter, his eyes moving from the cutting board to the window and back again. It felt like he was measuring something beyond the food. We ate at the dining table, the sound of cutlery and the faint tick of the clock filling the quiet. Conversation stayed light, plans for the next few days, the weather forecast, the possibility of replacing the back porch light. When the meal was done, he cleared the plates while I packed the leftovers. We moved around each other easily, as though the kitchen were following a map we'd both memorized. After the dishes were done, we found ourselves back in the living room. The evening light was low, the first signs of dusk settling outside. I turned on the lamp near the couch, its warm glow softening the edges of the room. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth from his shoulder, but neither of us spoke at first. The quiet seemed to hold more than any sentence could. Eventually, he said, almost casually, that it was strange how quickly the week had passed. I agreed, though my mind lingered on the details of each day, how they had built on one another without my quite realizing it. There was an awareness now, one I couldn't ignore, of how easily routine can tilt into something else. I turned slightly toward him, and our eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't drawn out. We moved toward each other, and the space closed. We spent the night together. The rest of the evening passed without markers. At some point I turned off the lamp, the room settling into the soft dark that comes when a house has accepted the end of a day. Outside, the street was quiet, only the occasional car passing. Inside, there was nothing to distinguish the hours except for the steady passage of time itself, and the knowledge, kept unspoken, that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. In the early hours, I woke briefly and lay still, listening to the muted hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the settling walls. The air was cool against my face, the rest of the house wrapped in silence. I closed my eyes again, knowing morning would arrive soon enough, and that it would bring with it the same walls, the same rooms, but not the same days. The morning light was muted, filtered through a thin layer of clouds that dulled the edges of everything. I woke with a heaviness that wasn't from lack of sleep but from knowing the day would carry a weight the house hadn't felt before. The air in the bedroom was cool, and for a moment I lay still, listening to the faint rhythm of footsteps somewhere below. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs, steady and grounding. When I came down, he was at the kitchen counter, leaning on one arm while scrolling through his phone. The coffee pot was still half full, and I poured myself a cup without a word. We exchanged a brief greeting, nothing more, our voices measured, as though both of us were keeping our tone within safe boundaries. The clink of my spoon against the mug felt louder than it should have. I moved to the window, watching the street. The rain from 2 nights ago had left faint stains on the pavement that still hadn't fully dried. A neighbor crossed with her dog, pausing at the same patch of grass as always. The scene was ordinary, but my mind refused to settle into it. Instead, it kept circling back to the night before, to the way routine had tipped without fanfare into something irreversible. After breakfast, I tried to busy myself with small chores. I gathered the laundry, sorted it by color, and started a load in the machine. The hum of the cycle filled the background, a mechanical reassurance that at least one thing today would have a clear beginning and end. He was in the living room. I could hear the low sound of the news on the television, the announcer's voice rising and falling in practiced cadence. Around mid-morning, I decided to go through the hall closet. It had been gathering clutter for months, coats we no longer wore, a stack of mismatched shoes, an umbrella with a bent rib. I pulled everything out onto the floor, sorting into piles. He appeared in the doorway at one point, glanced at the mess, and offered to take some items to the donation bin in town later. I nodded, thanked him, and he left me to it. By the time the closet was reorganized, the sky had darkened slightly, the clouds thicker now. I made tea and sat at the dining table, letting my thoughts slow just enough to plan the rest of the day. My husband had sent another message, a short update about his work, no mention of when he might call. I read it twice, then placed the phone face down. The words were fine, but they carried the same distance they had for months. The afternoon unfolded quietly. He left for a short while, presumably to run the errands he'd mentioned. I took the time to vacuum the living room and wipe down the kitchen counters. There was comfort in the order of it, in restoring the surfaces to a clean state. When he returned, he carried a small bag from the hardware store and a paper sack from the bakery. He set the bread on the counter without comment, then went to put away the rest. We had a light lunch, slices of the fresh bread, cheese, and apples from the market earlier in the week. Conversation stayed on neutral topics, the quality of the bread, the cooler weather, the repairs left to be done before winter. The tone between us was calm, functional, and yet every pause seemed longer than it needed to be, as if we were both aware of what lay beneath it. After lunch, he went back to the garage to work on his project. I stayed in the kitchen to prep vegetables for dinner, chopping them into even pieces and setting them aside. The sound of tools carried faintly through the open window, a reminder of his presence without requiring me to see him. I found myself lingering over the work, stretching it out more than necessary. By mid-afternoon, the light had shifted again, the clouds breaking just enough to let a thin beam of sunlight spill across the table. I took my tea to the living room, sat in the armchair, and opened a book. Reading was slow, my eyes moved over the words, but the meaning slipped past. I could hear the steady ticking of the hallway clock, each second marking the passage of a day I couldn't quite anchor. He came in from the garage just before 4, wiping his hands on a rag. He mentioned he'd made progress, that only a few small adjustments remained. I said that was good, and the exchange ended there. The air between us was polite, careful, almost deliberate in its restraint. As the afternoon faded, I began preparing dinner. A simple stew, bread warmed in the oven, a small salad. The smells filled the kitchen, layering one on top of the other until the whole room felt wrapped in them. He set the table while I finished, placing the plates and glasses with precise movements. We ate quietly, each of us speaking only when necessary, our words chosen with care. After the meal, we cleared the table together. The rhythm of washing and drying dishes felt mechanical, each action sliding neatly into the next. Once the kitchen was clean, he moved to the living room, taking up a seat on the couch. I stayed standing for a moment, watching the way the lamplight softened the room, then joined him. We didn't turn on the television. Instead, we sat in the quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the settling house. It felt as though both of us were waiting for something to shift, though neither of us named it. At one point our eyes met, holding for just a second longer than needed, and then we both looked away. The rest of the evening passed without incident. I folded laundry in the bedroom while he read in the living room. Later, I checked the locks on the doors, a habit I'd picked up without realizing when it began. Upstairs, I could hear the faint sound of water running in the bathroom, the muted thud of a cabinet closing. When I finally lay down, the room was dark except for the faint glow from the street lamp outside. The quiet was complete, but not empty, it carried the weight of everything unspoken. I closed my eyes, knowing the next day would arrive with its own set of motions, and that we would both step into them as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. The next morning began with an unexpected message from my husband, short, almost casual, saying he would be home a day earlier than planned. The word sat on my phone screen for a long moment before I put it down on the counter. The kitchen felt sharper, somehow, as if the edges of the cabinets had straightened overnight. Outside, the air was bright and dry, the light cutting clean across the yard. I made coffee and stood by the window while it brewed, my hands wrapped around the edge of the counter. The street was unusually still for that time of day, no dog walkers or delivery vans yet. He came into the kitchen quietly, nodding a greeting before pouring his own cup. I didn't mention the message right away. There was no reason to, not yet. The morning passed with a kind of deliberate normalcy. I gathered the laundry from upstairs, started the first load, and tidied the hallway. He worked outside, repairing a loose section of the fence. I could hear the occasional thud of the hammer, the creak of wood shifting back into place. From the kitchen window, I watched him once or twice, his movements measured and steady. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside with 2 glasses of water. He took one, nodding his thanks, and set it on the fence post before returning to the work. I stood there for a moment longer than needed, looking at the section he'd already fixed. The boards were neatly aligned, their lines even. Then I turned back toward the house, the air cool against my face. Inside, I wiped down the counters, reorganized the pantry shelves, and made a mental list of things to cook for the next 2 days. The act of planning gave me something to focus on, a framework that kept my thoughts from wandering too far in any direction. By the time I checked the laundry, the first load was done, and I hung the clothes neatly on the drying rack near the window. Just before noon, he came in from the yard, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. He mentioned that the fence should hold through the winter now, and I said it looked good. The conversation was functional, but it left a faint echo in the air, as if something more had almost been spoken. We decided on a simple lunch, soup from the previous night's dinner and bread from the bakery. The kitchen was warm, the air scented faintly with rosemary from the jar on the windowsill. We ate without much talking, each of us focused on our bowls, the quiet stretching between spoonfuls. After lunch, he went to the garage, and I stepped outside to sweep the porch. The leaves were beginning to fall more heavily now, layering in corners and along the steps. I swept them into a neat pile, then carried them to the compost bin at the side of the house. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere nearby, and the sound of a rake drifted from a neighbor's yard. When I came back inside, the house felt different, not tense, but expectant. I moved from room to room, dusting surfaces, straightening cushions, checking small details that didn't really need attention. In the guest room, I adjusted the curtains so they hung evenly and smoothed the bedspread with the flat of my hand. My reflection in the window caught my eye for a moment before I turned away. By mid-afternoon, the sun had shifted low enough to cast a warm glow across the living room floor. I sat in the armchair with a book, though I read little of it. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, the sound loud in the quiet house. At one point, I heard him come in from the garage and set something down on the counter, but he didn't linger in the kitchen. Later, I started preparing dinner early, partly to fill the space, partly because it felt like a way to mark the day. I peeled potatoes, chopped vegetables, and set a pot to simmer on the stove. The kitchen filled with the slow, steady scent of cooking, the kind that seeps into the walls. He joined me after a while, slicing bread and setting the table without being asked. We ate just as the light outside began to fade. The conversation was quiet, grounded in ordinary topics, the weather, the work still to be done before winter, the grocery list for tomorrow. The food was good, but I barely noticed it. My thoughts kept drifting back to the message on my phone that morning, and the way the timing now felt like a door swinging open unexpectedly. After dinner, we cleared the table together, moving around each other with the ease of practiced routine. The dishes were washed and dried, the counters wiped clean. When the kitchen was back in order, he stepped out to the yard to check the fence one last time, and I stood at the sink, looking out the window at the fading light. Inside again, he went to the living room, settling into the couch with a notebook. I stayed at the table for a moment, my hands resting flat on the wood, listening to the low sound of his pen moving across the page. Eventually, I joined him, sitting in the armchair. The lamp beside him threw a soft light across the room, the shadows stretching along the walls. We didn't speak much. The quiet was steady, unbroken except for the scratch of the pen and the occasional shift of the clock's hands. It felt like we were both waiting for the day to end, though for different reasons. When I finally went upstairs, the house was still, the air carrying the faint scent of dinner. I checked the windows, turned off the remaining lights, and paused in the hallway for a moment before entering my room. Tomorrow would come quickly, and with it the change I'd been expecting but not prepared for. I lay down in the dark, the steady hum of the house around me, and tried to imagine the shape of the hours ahead. The morning arrived without hurry, the light spreading slowly across the walls as if unsure of its welcome. I woke before the alarm, aware of a certain tension in the air, not loud or obvious, but steady. My husband was due home today. The thought settled into place without fanfare, and I lay still for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the soft tick of the hallway clock. When I stepped into the kitchen, the air was cool and faintly scented with the bread we had baked 2 days ago. He was already there, standing near the counter with a mug in his hand, the steam curling in front of his face. We exchanged a short greeting. I poured myself coffee and leaned against the opposite counter, watching the light filter in through the window above the sink. The sky outside was pale, washed of color, the kind of morning that keeps its tone quiet. I spent the first part of the day occupied with small, deliberate tasks. I stripped the linens from the guest room, folded the blankets, and set fresh sheets in place. Each corner was smoothed with care, each pillow aligned just so. The curtains were drawn halfway to let in light but keep the room contained. In the hallway, I dusted the narrow table by the wall, straightened the small ceramic bowl where my husband kept his keys, and wiped away the faint layer that had gathered there. He moved between the garage and the yard, finishing small repairs that didn't require much time but seemed to fill his attention. I heard the muffled thud of tools being set down, the squeak of the back gate as it opened and closed. Occasionally, our paths crossed, me carrying laundry to the bedroom, him passing through to get a screwdriver, but neither of us lingered in the same space for long. By midday, the air felt different. The sun had risen higher, the light sharper now, catching on the edges of the shelves and casting long, distinct lines across the floor. I began preparing lunch early, choosing something simple, leftover bread, cheese, and a salad made from what remained in the fridge. He joined me at the table without ceremony. We ate in a measured quiet, the clink of cutlery against plates marking the rhythm of the meal. Our conversation stayed in safe territory, the weather, the work on the fence, the timing of my husband's return. When I mentioned that he might arrive in the evening, his glance held mine for a moment before returning to his plate. After lunch, I turned my attention to the living room. The cushions were straightened, the rug vacuumed, the surfaces cleared of anything that did not belong. I opened the window just enough to let in fresh air without letting the breeze disturb the neatness. He remained outside, checking the porch steps for loose boards. The sound of his movements carried through the open window in short, familiar bursts. By late afternoon, I felt the weight of the day pressing more firmly. My husband's message confirming his arrival time came through while I was in the kitchen. I read it twice, then set the phone down on the counter, the screen face up. The rest of the preparation for his return felt automatic, ensuring the fridge was stocked, placing fresh towels in the bathroom, checking that the entryway was clear. Each task was small, but together they built a kind of order that I hoped would speak louder than anything else. Around 5, the sky began to change. The light thinned, turning cooler, and shadows stretched further across the yard. I decided to check the guest room one final time. The bed was exactly as I had left it, the curtains still half drawn, the air faintly scented with the detergent from the fresh linens. I lingered there a moment, my hand on the doorframe, listening to the muted sound of footsteps downstairs. When I came back into the hallway, I saw him at the foot of the stairs, his expression unreadable but steady. He said something about the last of the tools being put away, and I nodded, my voice even when I replied. We moved toward the living room at the same time, the distance between us closing without intention. The sound of a car in the driveway reached us before we spoke again. It was unmistakable, the slow crunch of tires over the gravel, the shift of gears as the engine cut. I felt it more than I heard it, the way a change in air pressure announces a storm. We were still in the living room when the front door opened. My husband's footsteps crossed the entryway with the confidence of someone returning to a familiar place. I turned toward the sound just as he stepped into view, his eyes moving from me to the space around us. Then they landed on the site between us, me standing close to the one who had been here in his absence. The air between us two waited to pass as coincidence. The moment held, neither of us moving. His gaze stayed fixed, not searching but registering, the way a person reads the final line of a page and understands without needing it explained. The house was silent except for the faint tick of the hallway clock. I couldn't tell if seconds passed or minutes. The stillness felt complete, as if even the air had paused to see what would happen next. My husband didn't speak, but something in his face shifted, an understanding settling in without words. Behind him, the open door let in a thin draft, carrying with it the scent of the outside, the cool, sharp, and utterly different from the air we had been breathing all week. I stood there, caught between the two spaces that now existed in the same house, the one that had been before and the one that had just arrived. Neither could be undone, and neither could fully claim the next moment. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't with words, but with the smallest sound, the door closing behind him. The latch clicked into place, and the air seemed to shift again, heavier now, as though the house itself understood what had just entered with him.